So Alexandre Deulofeu was a self-taught Spanish historian who wrote a set of 11 books under the title The Mathematics of History. And for him, world history was about a regular repeating cycle that operated within a number of different civilizations. And he identified 8 laws governing this cycle. So let's write those up. So firstly, he said that the cycle involves an oscillation between periods of fragmentation and periods of unity. So oscillation between fragmentation and unity. And then the period of fragmentation lasts 650 years. And the period of unity lasts 1,050 years, giving a total cycle duration of 1,700 years. Then, thirdly, there is a sequence of phases that describes the cycle. And we'll draw a diagram of that in a moment and what those phases are. Fourthly, it affects all areas of social life. Politics, economics, art, science, philosophy, etc. Fifthly, all the civilizations follow the cycle, but with varying lags. So, for example, he sees the cycle as getting started earliest in the Middle East, and then Europe starts later on. So the Middle East starts earlier and finishes earlier, and Europe starts later and finishes later. So whereas one civilization is finishing its cycle, the other is still completing that cycle. Then for the 6th law, he says that although the cycle involves a rise and fall of creativity, the area of maximum creativity within each civilization shifts from cycle to cycle. So, for example, in Europe, which is one of his civilizations, the area of maximum creativity has shifted from Greece to Italy to northwestern Europe over the course of these successive 1,700-year cycles. So I'll write that up. And his 7th point is that within the periods of unity, there are empires come and go. And so these empires, he says, last 500 to 600 years. And he has a view of the structure of an imperial cycle, which again we'll come to in a moment. And lastly, this whole process is not a smooth up and down, but involves periods of progress and then reversals. So it's a kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. So not a smooth process, but progress and reversal. And then he identifies a total of 7 civilizations that are the theatre of this play, this cyclical process. And we'll write those up too. So the 7 civilizations are Mesopotamia, Iran, Egypt, Central Asia, China, India, and Europe. And we write them in that order because this is the order in which he sees the cycle as starting. So it starts first in Mesopotamia and last in Europe. So let's just have another look at that. We'll just draw up a chart of the world and put it on that. Okay, so there's Eurasia, Africa, and his 7 civilizations. We've got Mesopotamia here, that's number 1, and then Iran, number 2, Egypt, number 3, Central Asia, 4, China, 5, India, 6, and Europe, 7. And we can understand this in terms of the cycle sort of spreading out from the centre of the world island here. So it gets started at the centre in Mesopotamia, and then it spreads out from there. So firstly it spreads east into Iran, and then later into Egypt. Then it spreads a bit further into Central Asia and to China. So we can see that this is kind of the easiest route for it to spread along. And then it spreads down into India, and lastly it reaches Europe. So there's a kind of ripple effect. The cycle gets started here and the ripple spreads out, and then the next cycle starts and the new ripple spreads out, and that just keeps happening over and over again. And the first cycle, the first civilisational cycle, is for Mesopotamia from 5250 to 3550 BC, and for Europe, which, as we see from here, lags Mesopotamia the most, he estimates it's from 2700 to 1000 BC. So in fact Mesopotamia had finished the first cycle before Europe even got started, and we can see that these are 1700 years, as he says the cycle is. And let's just plot that on a time chart as well. So there's 5000 BC, 43210. There's the cycle for Mesopotamia. That's cycle number 1, and there is cycle number 1 for Europe. So there was no civilization we could say no civilizational process in Europe here. It got started about 2700, the first cycle in his Europe civilization. And so that's that ripple that propagates out through these other civilizations and eventually reaches Europe and stimulates that to get started. And then these just repeat, and the same here. Okay, now let's have a look at his phases of this cycle in a bit more detail. Okay, so here is Deulofeu's model of his cycle. The blue line shows the ups and downs of the civilization. As usual with these kinds of theories, it's not really clear exactly what this is measuring in terms of the rise and fall, but we should think in terms of social vigour and creativity largely, insofar as this peak is labelled as maximum creativity. But also prosperity and orderliness, all those kinds of things that might be associated with it. So the cycle starts with the birth of a new set of arts, science and philosophy, the seeds of a whole new discoveries in those areas. And it then proceeds to the towards this point of maximum creativity. In terms of social institutions, it says firstly corporatism. So that's really like the feudal arrangements that we've discussed before. Then that evolves into democracy, so the idea that people should have a say in their own government. And during this time there is, he says, the gradual progress of the submissive class. So ordinary people, their way of life becomes easier, they become more prosperous, and they acquire more and more of a say in their own affairs. And then past the maximum creativity, democracy starts to decay and absolutism comes in, so tyrants and authoritarian rule. And during this time there's also now decadence in these arts, science and philosophy. So they've reached their peak. There's very little improvement. There's nowhere really for them to go. They've exhausted their potential. And it descends into the phase of capitalism and proletarianism, so economic elites and very large economic inequality. And people are, just wage labourers. And it's during this time that the first empire appears within the civilization. I should have said, this is the period of fragmentation up to the point of maximum creativity, and beyond that is the period of unity. The civilization has become politically and culturally unified, and it's at this point that the first empire emerges to bring it all under one government, and then later there can be a second empire somewhere around here. So these last, as we said, 500 to 600 years. This is characterized by cultural inactivity. So again, it's like we've seen for other civilization theorists, that the end of the civilization is a period when it has lost all creativity, and innovation has ceased. And whereas for people like Spengler, that's it. This civilization has, stops, but just can carry on in a stagnant state indefinitely. For Deulofeu, it begins again on the same territory, a new civilization. So for him, each civilization kind of is a one-shot. But on the same territory, you can have another civilization and then another civilization, and so on. So you just keep getting new civilizations reappearing when the old one has reached its conclusion. And then he divides this whole cycle into 6 named phases, which I'll write up. So these phases are firstly the priestly aristocracy. So it's the thinkers, the creative innovators, developing new sciences and philosophies. Those are the leaders of society. But then leadership passes to an economic aristocracy, those people who control land and control production. Then within the civilization, it moves into the federal phase. So the different parts of the territory that are within the civilization retain some autonomy, but under some kind of overarching political entity. Then there's a unitary phase when they lose their autonomy and they become completely unified under a central government. And then there's decline and disintegration. So this whole thing gradually falls apart. And finally, the civilization is so weak that people are in a state of servitude, whether to an outside civilization or to some kind of authoritarian group within the civilization that forms this second empire. The people are in a state here they've lost all their freedom, they're just in servitude. And let's draw up a little table to see how he applies these phases to Western civilization. Okay, so I've written up Deulofeu's dates for the third cycle in Europe, which is the one we're still in. So he sees that starting in AD 650. This is the priestly aristocracy, so we can think of, you know, the beginnings of Christianity as the faith that's uniting Europe. Then the economic aristocracy, so the emergence of great feudal lords. The federal phase he puts happening in 1300, so we can perhaps imagine this was the time when the papacy was very powerful and Europe's governments considered themselves under the authority of the Pope. The unitary phase, 1500, well, perhaps culturally, certainly not politically, but by this time Europe had become so well united through trade and diplomatic interaction that there was one common culture across Europe. And then he sees decline and disintegration setting in about 1800. So the core European idea was here beginning to be challenged by new philosophies arising, like communism, for example. And so European culture was beginning to fall apart. And then he saw Europe passing into the state of servitude in 2025. And he saw that state of servitude as lasting another 425 years to 2450. So that's what we have got to look forward to, according to Deulofeu. And now I said we'll also have a look at his theory of the stages of empire, so how these rise and fall. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so this is what the trajectory of an empire looks like according to Deulofeu. It has two stages of expansion. The first expansion lasting about 1.5 centuries. I think we said that the overall duration is 500 to 600 years typically, so I'll put it as 600 here. So there's a first expansion, and then that's followed by what he calls the Great Depression. So here things are getting better. The territory, so the empire's expanding not just in terms of territory, but also economic expansion. And then there's a depression. So we can think particularly of an economic depression, poverty, and you know, people aren't building so much, they're not innovating. But then out of that comes a second expansion here, and then there's a blip, a period of military disorder, so general war, and then it rises again, and then it's now kind of stable for a while. This is imperial fullness, so the empire has achieved a stable condition which lasts for a while, but then it gradually declines until it disappears. So, you know, we can see how perhaps he's thinking about mapping this onto the Roman Empire. So in the Republican period, Rome was getting greater and greater and expanding around the Mediterranean. But then there was a crisis, and then it rebounded from that. But then there was the phase of the triumvirates and the great wars, civil wars, that then led to the foundation of the Principate, as it's called, under the first Emperor Augustus. And then the empire was relatively unified and stable from then on, even though it declined. In fact, there were some further periods of fragmentation in this period, but perhaps not so striking, more short-lived anyway. He glosses over that kind of thing. So that's the general view. But well, I suppose in fact he does say that there's progress and reversal, so we can expect that it doesn't just follow this exactly smoothly, but there's fluctuations within that as well. And now let's just have a look at the timings of this for a few typical empires. So Okay, just to give some idea of how Deulofeu maps this onto real history, I've listed up a few empires. He does this same kind of breakdown for a couple of dozen empires. So this is just a sample. We've got the first expansion, the depression phase, the second expansion, and then the decay and disintegration phase here, in what I've labelled imperial fullness. So for the ancient Persian Empire, it got started in 835 BC, and its first expansion lasted 100 years. We can see from 835 to 733. Then the depression phase, very short, just 4 years, 525 to 521. And then the second expansion, 521 to 490, so that's 30 years. And then decay and disintegration, that's lasting over roughly 160 years of decay and disintegration, giving a total duration for the Persian Empire of 504 years. And then we've got the Roman Empire starting here in 270 BC and persisting through to 305 AD. So 160 to 305 is its decay and disintegration. Now, its depression phase is very long here, whereas this was just 4 years. This is from 129 BC to AD 58. So that's almost 200 years of depression there. And then this second expansion. Then we've got the Vikings in AD 850, and you can see here now his dates are just impressionistic. They're all, to the nearest half century, 850 to 1050, 1050 to 1150, whereas some of the others are based on specific battles or events. And for the Roman Empire, I didn't say, but that's 575 years in total, 550 years for the Vikings. Then the Austrian or Austro-Hungarian Empire, starting in AD 1437. Its depression period is long, century long, like the Vikings as well. They're 1700 to 1813, and that comes to an end in 1918, the end of the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared, was broken up. And then there's the British Empire, getting started in 1607, according to Deulofeu, and it goes through these phases, and its decay and disintegration phase is just 12 months. He sees the British Empire as having started to decay and disintegrate, and it disappeared almost overnight with decolonisation. And that gives the British Empire a total duration of only 343 years. So we can see that there's a certain arbitrariness to Deulofeu's theory that allows it to be flexibly stretched and squeezed to fit real history. And it's also a bit suspect, the idea of a rigid cycle lasting exactly 1700 years. But it's certainly interesting, the idea of a civilisational cycle that gets started at the centre of the world island and then ripples out from there. And it also gives us food for thought, the idea that European civilization is now entering into a phase of servitude under authoritarian governments and outside invaders, and that this phase of servitude is going to last over 400 years.